Hey everybody, I'm Robert Donovan. Welcome to this episode of Not Trekonomics. According to Star Trek canon, Zefram Cochrane's first warp-driven spaceflight attracted the attention of the Vulcans, who investigate and make first contact. Humans, realizing that they're not alone in the cosmos, cast aside their differences and prejudices to unite as one people. A single world government is eventually formed, and poverty, war, and disease are eliminated, creating a huge economic abundance. And this enables the creation of a society in which everyone works solely to better themselves and the rest of humanity, and reputation, expertise, and character come to replace the old money as the currency. Okay, couple of reality checks if we want to get to real-world post-satiety. First, no warp drive, still highly theoretical and may not even be possible, and if the Fermi paradox is to be believed, there will be no Vulcans. Therefore, absent the arrival of friendly aliens causing humans to cast aside their prejudices, the EU migrant crisis and refugee crisis powerfully indicate that humans won't cast aside prejudices very fast, and I'm not really talking about the Europeans there, if I'm being completely honest. Furthermore, easy to talk about economic abundance and post-satiety economies, but you need to create the abundance first. Then the post-satiety, not the other way around, goes against basic survival necessity otherwise. For example, do you worry that the workers in the grocery store you currently shop at might lose their jobs if another chain put up a closer store to your house that offered better service and more selections at the same or lower prices? Or have you ever had an employer who was so rich they gave you a paycheck solely from the desire to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and shelter the homeless, regardless of your skills, job performance, or cost to the company of doing that? And let us not forget the benevolent government that graciously forces you to give up part of your income every year to be spent on proxy wars and other assorted idiocy, and then thoughtfully puts you in jail if you decide you don't care to play along. The Star Trek writers hand-wave all of this away with the "we don't use money" and post-scarcity. We cannot do that here in the 21st century. So rather than rely on the troll and monkey logic of Star Trek's first contact scenario, can't talk today, I choose instead to rely on rational thought and to use free market capital formation to reduce poverty, crime, and if we're really lucky, war, although I don't hold out much hope for that. To that end, it would be awfully helpful if the US government stopped running up debt, got the budget into surplus, and kept it there. The U.S. debt is currently $19.6 trillion. That's 106% of GDP and about 586% of 2016 revenue, which is referred to as receipts in the budget. That was $3.27 trillion. Unfunded obligations, that's money we have to set aside today to pay for the future costs of ongoing expenses such as the national debt, Medicare, and Social Security, come to about $80 trillion. I have seen higher estimates of that. I've also seen a few lower ones. I'm using that as a middle-of-the-road approximation. Congress is like the homeless guy who wins $1 million lottery, invested at 5% per year, gets a mortgage on a 20,000 square foot mansion, and then gives his closest street friends about $10K, and then wonders why he can't make the payments. Congress buys for its friends, in a similar fashion, things like wars, countries, an ever-expanding welfare surveillance state, maybe a matching set of economic bubbles and crashes, financed via ever more devalued dollars, made so by ever more abuse of debt monetization. If the U.S. is in such a bad financial fix, one might ask, why haven't we gone the way of perhaps Greece, Italy, or maybe even fun-filled Venezuela? The U.S. has an advantage here, and it's an advantage more than twice as big as any other country. A GDP so huge that the U.S. can afford debt payments that would literally bankrupt any other country. And when I say literally, I mean really literally, not as in Trump is literally Hitler. It used to be said in the 70s that you were nobody until you could sign for a loan with dignity. Well, the interest alone on the U.S. national debt in 2016 was $433 billion. Now that is status, baby. Of course, the higher the debt, the more revenue it takes to cover that interest, and the less economic slowdown it takes to cause complete ruin. So even that big GDP advantage isn't going to save us unless we stop running up debts at some point. at least before the debt gets so high that the tax base can't cover the interest payments anymore. I mean, but even if that happened, how bad could it be? This is the USA. This is America. We'd only be missing payments on the scale of trillions. What's the worst that could happen? Well, mass unemployment, maybe some starvation, and maybe World War III, which it looks like Congress wants to do anyway because they keep poking a stick in the eye of the Russian bear. Now, if individuals and businesses can look at how much money is coming in and not spend more than that, one might also ask, why can't governments? I have just done so rhetorically. Governments are not market-facing, and that's the problem. They don't have to bother about pesky things like, profits, competition, or overspending. So they just take whatever they spent last year. They call that the baseline, so you won't know what they're talking about. Increase spending on existing programs for inflation, population growth, and the cost of any new programs, and voila, it's a budget. This is like you or me going out and spending as much as we wanted and just charging whatever our paycheck didn't cover to our credit cards. But since the government can print money out of thin air to pay off their debts, they have effectively a really high credit card limit. Speaking of paychecks, by the way, does Congress ever look at revenue, you might wonder? Well, of course they do. How do you think they know how big the deficit is each year? Besides, do you think the federal government would put the taxpayers on the hook for tens of trillions without a solid debt payment plan? Well, you'll be relieved as I was to know that Congress assures us that the money will come in to pay it off someday. We've all been we've all been there, right? I mean, you've run up trillions in debts, and you're on a decades-long binge, and nervous lenders are telling you to cut back or no more loans for you. You'd think at some point they would have to cut spending, right? Well, what would you do? Well, you'd commit billion-dollar accounting fraud. It's easy. Just increase spending by one amount, say 5%, then reduce the increase from 5% to 3%, and tell your lenders you've cut spending by 2%. Problem solved. Good enough for Congress is good enough for me. So I asked my accountant, because my income went up by $3,000 in 2015, but only $1,500 in 2016. So I called him and I asked him if I could declare a 50% drop in my income on my taxes based on that. Well, he said that's not allowed. Stupid tax laws. As I abandoned that tax strategy, I wondered, what if Congress did something crazy, like look at prior year receipts to calculate a baseline rather than spending? I mean, if the Fed spent no more than receipts each year, the way we do with our paychecks, problem solved. So why not just make receipts a spending cap? We'll call it receipt-based budgeting and abbreviate it RBB. That way we can do like t-shirts and slogans or something. We can't use 2017 receipts for this because we don't know what 2017 receipts are going to be until 2017 is over. But we do know what 2016 receipts were, so we can use them. So more generally, we'll use prior year receipts as the baseline. And we'll use a little rational thought to get a spending cap. And if we do that, I think you'll find we can do some pretty amazing things. So let's start by stating the obvious. We can't and shouldn't predict or spend future revenue ever. 2017 receipts may come in higher or lower than 2016, but we cannot know which one or by how much. So how do we get around this? Well, first is to understand that receipts going up is not a problem for the same reason that you prefer a raise to getting fired. And receipts tend to go up when the economy expands. So just setting prior receipts as a spending cap, 100% of prior year receipts, would have gotten us surpluses in all but 10 of the last 66 years since 1950. And it would have taken cuts of less than 7% to avoid going into debt entirely. So we're not talking about big cuts. The range was a high of about 7% to a low of about, 0.4%, and most of them clustered around the average of 3%. So just setting 100% of prior year receipts as a spending cap gets consistent surpluses, but it still leaves us vulnerable to recessions when receipts are most likely to drop, and it requires spending cuts after the recession. That's not only darn inconvenient, it has an unhappy tendency to tempt corporatist globalist politicians to meddle in the economy to pay off cronies who got them elected. Historically, this has had a nasty tendency to create bubbles and crashes during economic expansions and make recessions longer and more severe. The most well-known example of this, I maintain, is the Great Depression, and we're going to have a whole video on why that's so, but just for now, it's there. I'll put some sources below. A great book to read on the Great Depression is Amity Schlei's The Forgotten Man. We'll put a link to that on Amazon below. But more recent examples of this kind of idiocy causing more problems than it solves would be the dot-com and real estate bubbles and their associated crashes in 2000 and 2008 respectively. And of course the Great Recession, which I believe they say officially ended in 2014, but which is arguably still going on because the quality of jobs that have come back in that recovery are not as high paying or as high tech. That's mostly service jobs. Since the recovery, that's the Obama recovery. It's not really gotten us out of anything because the new jobs you're getting don't match your old payment, the old rate of pay. We could avoid all of this meddling and get surpluses in recessions by spending less than 100% of prior year receipts and cutting or freezing spending when recessions happen and just waiting for the recession to end, which is what I would recommend doing. Best thing to do is just let Congress sit on its hands when you get recessions by any means necessary. There's a blog post I'm going to be putting up on minds.com, if it's not already there, on exactly how much less than 100% of prior year receipts we should use, why it works that way, and how what we do with the surplus would work. But in dealing with recessions, it's critical to understand that deficits are a spending control problem and not a tax problem. We're going to cover tax reform in the next videos on this legislative agenda topic, which I'm calling the economic template, the post-satiety economic template topic. But for receipt-based budgeting, RBB, we're going to leave taxes alone and look strictly at receipts to control spending. So since 1950, which I'm using as the start of the Cold War / proxy war era / economy, your garden variety recession, which was say between 9 and 24 months, which would not be 2008 by the way, caused receipts to drop between 7% and 0.4%, as I said before. The majority of those clustered around 3%, as I also said before. Politicians love to buy votes during recessions by promising to spend money or jigger taxes to help one or more cronies adversely affected by them. This kind of meddling is the very thing that A, makes recessions worse, and B, makes the national debt an absolute nightmare. To avoid this and get the national debt under control, the best approach, I think, would be to cut marginal tax rates slightly, leave just a little more money in the economy. That will not be enough, as the supply side Laffer curve neocon Republicans constantly say. That will not be enough to spur new economic investment, but it will be enough probably. The trouble with recessions is that people tend to derail plans for new expenditures until the recession is over. If we cut tax rates just a little bit, it probably won't entice anyone to put in any new initiatives or start any new expenditures or growth initiatives, but it will probably keep them from canceling any existing plans, right? So we'll let the market figure out then where to target future growth. Little economic jargon got thrown in. Let me explain how that works briefly. When you just choose to buy an Android over an iPhone, you're targeting economic growth to Android. When you choose to buy a Ford over a Chevy, you're targeting economic growth to Ford. When you choose to buy a Toyota over a Chevy, you're targeting economic growth to the workers in the United States that produce the Toyotas here and to Japan. Now, it turns out that we, the consumer, exercising free choice and our own judgment, are way better at figuring out where to target growth than the federal government has ever been and will ever be. They're just too far removed from the action to do it well. You don't want government bureaucrats deciding where the economy needs to have money put into it. That's done to help that's cronyism usually. That's what corporatists do. We don't want that. We want to be allowed to make our own choices. If that means that some big corporation loses money, they deserve to. They're not serving our needs as we have decided they should. And that we are the ones who should make that decision, not Congress and not some bureaucrat in an agency somewhere that decides that this sector or that sector needs the pump primed. So we're far better at targeting economic growth than any government agency or government edict ever was. Economic growth makes the tax base bigger and it makes revenues go up. That's why receipts have gone up so much in the last 66 years, because as the economy expands, the tax base goes up, so you're getting a bigger percentage you're getting the same percentage in tax receipts of a bigger number, a bigger GDP. Tax cuts, however, would reduce revenue immediately. So I'm suggesting a small tax cut, which will reduce revenue in the short term, but economic growth takes a little time to produce more revenue. Therefore, we need to spend slightly less than prior year receipts to build some room into the spending cap for tax cuts and unfunded obligations. Now, a cap of 90% of prior year receipts, we'll call this the RBB cap, would get us surpluses in any year receipts fall by less than 10%. It would give us plenty of room to cut taxes and generate surpluses large enough to fund personal income and retire accounts, which will also get a dedicated video of their own, and they are my remedy for unfunded obligations. For now, think of PIRAs as a universal private capital base or a universal starting capital base that can supplement and slowly replace Social Security and most welfare programs. Unless you get the wrong idea, they are not a universal basic income. They're a capital base from which you can use the capital to create extra income, which I think is actually a far better way to go. Now, as PIRAs grow, which are the abbreviation I use for personal income and retirement accounts, as they grow, demand for government programs would diminish, and that would drive down both unfunded obligations and current costs. So there we are. In a few minutes of reasoned thought, we've come up with a basic budget system that gets the budget into surplus and keeps it there. And I am sure that those career politicians can totally be trusted to spend those surpluses wisely. I mean, look at Solyndra and the bank bailouts and the bridge to nowhere, one of my personal favorites, hope it's one of yours, and over $200 billion per year in duplicated and overlapping programs. What could possibly go wrong with leaving that decision about what to do with the surpluses up to Congress? Okay. We're going to have to require that any surpluses be split immediately upon receipt, 1/3 to debt payoff, 1/3 to tax rate cuts, and 1/3 to the PIRAs. We also want to cap emergency spending at 20% of the RBB cap. Remember, never let an emergency go to waste, Rahm Emanuel said. That's government code for use it to get around any kind of spending constraints and load up all the pork barrel spending you want. We also want to do a moratorium on new unfunded obligations until the existing unfunded liabilities are less than 20% of GDP. And that's to make sure that Congress doesn't cut spending today and then pile on new expenses later that would basically just bust the budget with future spending. Think of it as removing temptation from their path in advance. All right, now, Congress is not going to do all of this willingly. We're going to have to make them, because entrenched interest, special or otherwise, will make getting receipt-based budgeting passed at the federal level exceedingly hard. It won't be that much easier at the states, but it will be far easier than trying to do it first at the federal level. And I think that's our best bet, is to target the state and local level first. Because if a state has a surplus, and believe it or not, in 2015, 39 states had revenue surpluses. But if you're in surplus, a 1-year freeze gets just about any state that's currently in surplus. Because if you're in surplus, you're already spending less than 100% of prior year receipts. So a 1-year freeze would get you to the 90% RBB cap. And as you started funding the PIRAs, they would enable tax cuts and let citizens supplement or replace, the two together, the surpluses and the PIRAs, would enable tax cuts and let citizens of those states supplement or replace federal Social Security income with PIRA income. Now, how might that, think about that for a minute, how might that alter the attitudes of voters, businesses, and senior citizens towards the federal government, particularly Social Security. Imagine what a coalition of RBB governors or a caucus of representatives and senators from RBB enacted states or states that had enacted RBB might accomplish in terms of things like the abuse of earmarks, the abuse of mandated spending for welfare and unemployment, and for legislation in support of states' rights as their state, imagine what they would do as their state debt and their taxes got lower and the PIRA balances grew, progressively freeing those states of dependence on federal money. And that's a big reason. That's a big part of the reason why the federal government keeps trying to come up with ways to give states money, because it makes those states dependent on the federal government, and the federal government can always threaten to take away the federal highway money or the federal, whatever other, money they get. Now, how about in state legislatures? Let's take it one level down. What about in state legislatures if RBB was adopted at the city and county level? This is what the Tea Party failed to do, in my opinion. They were basically trying to elect saviors who would figure all this out for them. Wrong approach. They needed to come up with a plan, as I'm trying to do here, and promote it from the grassroots up. So here are the takeaways for RBB. Use prior year receipts to calculate a baseline, cap spending at 90% of prior year receipts, and don't try to spend or predict future revenue. Any legislation that has automatic spending increases in it needs to have the language added to the effect of, as spending caps allow in the year the spending is scheduled. The idea, we're going to call that the 90% cap or the RBB cap. Second, it is your money first. Before Congress can give your money away to people who largely have not earned it, and they have to tax it from you. Before they have anything to tax, you have to earn the money or create the value to be taxed. So as soon as the Treasury collects 90% of prior year receipts for that year, in that year, anything beyond that is to be considered a surplus and split upon receipt and dispersed at 1/3 to the PRAs, 1/3 to debt reduction, and 1/3 to tax rate cuts. Third thing, don't change the tax system to balance the budget. Budget deficits are a spending control problem, not a tax and revenue problem. There is no tax system you can create that will allow you to spend more than you take in every year and not go broke. So balance the budget first, then use the tax system to maximize and efficiently gather revenue at the lowest rates you possibly can. We're going to cover that in the next videos on this topic. Fourth, do the biggest spending cuts in the first year to get the pain over with early and fast. It's going to require spending cuts if you want to go to RBB, if you're not already in surplus, and particularly at the federal level. And I'm going to be doing a list of cuts in the final video on this topic. But I want to go through all the points of the plan first so you'll understand which cuts I'm doing and where the cuts are coming from. But that will get its own video. But it's going to require cuts or a multi-year freeze in any state that's got a deficit, and that is going to be painful to somebody. Someone's always going to complain about that. So I think your best approach is to do the biggest cuts the first year, get the worst of the pain over with early, get it over quickly, and then move forward. Get them in the rear view. Fifth, all spending, including unfunded liabilities, is on budget, discretionary, and subject to Federal Accounting Standards Board accounting rules. Now, it turns out that the U.S. Treasury does something called the Financial Report of the U.S. Government every year, and it uses proper accounting rules, which is how we have some idea of what the unfunded liabilities are. A lot of the differences in the estimates of unfunded liabilities have to do with the assumptions you have to make when you're doing that about future value, present value, economic growth, tax rates. A lot of that goes into that. But the 80 trillion is the number I used here. I've seen estimates as high as 200 trillion. But I'm not sure. I think that might be a bit pessimistic, but I wouldn't be surprised if it turned out to be higher than 80 trillion. 6, cap total emergency spending and new or existing unfunded obligations at 20% of prior year receipts. We would also want to put a few more constraints on Congress there. We want to have, say, a 4/5 majority to bust the budget or to do emergency spending, to bust the spending cap or to do emergency spending. Any emergency spending you want to limit to things directly related to the emergency. You can't introduce any new programs, any new tax increases, or any unfunded obligations. And to make sure that happens, all emergency spending has to expire within 12 months. It is simply no good to cut spending this year and then pile on unfunded obligations in future years. It's just undoing on the back end what the receipt-based budgeting is trying to fix on the front end. And lastly, receipt-based budgeting will get us a surplus in any year which revenue falls by less than 10%. But in years when you have drops in receipts of more than 10%, you are going to get a surplus, or you're going to get a deficit. And in those years when you do get a deficit, only the debt necessary to cover the deficit can be borrowed, and spending has to be cut or frozen until receipts allow an increase under the 90% cap. Now, it turns out that following RBB, most of those deep recessions, like 2008, 2009, and actually that was a 16% drop in receipts that year. You actually have to go back to like 1932 or 33 to see a drop that big. And both of the recessions that we're talking about, the recession from the real estate crash and the recession from the crash of 29, were the result of government meddling in the economy, which, if they were following receipt-based budgeting, would be far less likely to occur. And therefore, I maintain that most of those big drops in receipts and big, hard-hitting recessions that really caused a lot of pain and suffering would never happen if you were only following this. And that is why I am now presenting this as our first career politician's nightmare to wake them up screaming in the night. How about this? Receipt-based budgeting, as I have just described it here, in the form of a constitutional amendment. As I said, going to RBB is going to require spending cuts. They will get their own video, or a multi-year spending freeze. We don't really need to do a video for that, though. The best way to reduce the pain of that is a robust and stable revenue stream. Now, receipt-based budgeting assumes that the effective tax rates are going to stay the same at first because I'm not messing with the tax system to balance the budget. But just because the effective tax rate stays the same does not mean that the tax structure has to stay the same. Receipt-based budgeting surpluses enable the systematic reduction and removal of many taxes. And the next series of videos on this topic, titled, Building a Sane Tax System, we're going to start with that nightmare of mindless, needless complexity, the U.S. income tax. We're going to examine our options for replacing it with a tax system that is easy to understand, inexpensive to audit, enforce, and administer, and which promotes the capital formation required to create a post-satiety economy. Following that, we're going to give a detailed explanation of the PIRAs, what they are and how they work. There's no date set for these yet because I'm still editing the show outlines. In our very next episode, though, we're going to be hitting the topic of human capital with an introduction to autotelic learning concepts. I've mentioned that in passing on a few previous episodes. We're going to dig into it a little more detail next episode. After that, because I do owe my Blender viewers a few videos yet, I'm going to do 2 Warp Jump videos. Warp Jump Part 1, we're going to create a Star Wars hyperspace jump effect. And Warp Jump Part 2, we're going to go to the other side of the sci-fi universe and do a Star Trek warp bubble effect. Following that, we're going to switch to social capital, and I haven't actually done this on this channel yet, but I am going to be doing it. So when I do it, I'm going to take it as a teachable moment, and I'm going to talk about social media integration, how you integrate your YouTube channel with your website and your Facebook page and all this good stuff. And we're going to use all the assets from this account here, the Blender stuff and the YouTube channel and my website and the Facebook. We're going to show you how to do that as a teachable moment when I get around to doing it, which is going to be the next episode after the Warp Jump stuff that we do with Blender. Little something for everybody, just in case you're not interested in one topic or another. Wanted to give everybody a heads up on what's coming up. Comments and questions are always welcome. And if you enjoyed this content, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks so much for watching, and may the balance of your day be awesome.